Kia ora. My name is Changzoo Song, and I teach about Korea and modern Korean history and Korean diaspora and Asian diaspora at the University of Auckland. Well, this is my great pleasure to come here today to share my experience many years ago, nearly 3 decades ago, when I traveled to Sakhalin twice. It was still under the rule of the Soviet Union. And I crossed Siberia 4 times by Trans-Siberian Railway. But anyway, today I want to share some stories about this island, which is called Sakhalin, but used to be called by Japanese Karafuto. And so to talk about these Koreans on the island of Sakhalin, I need to talk about first Korean migrations to Manchuria and Siberia, well, the Russian Far East in late 19th century. So I will briefly cover that, and then what happened when Koreans were on Sakhalin under the rule of Japan, and then later, suddenly the colonial master changed from Japanese to Soviet, and what happened, and how they were captured on the island until the early 1990s. And eventually they could return home, of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that's what I will talk briefly, and I will include some stories. So first of all, the Korean migrations happened in late 19th century. First actually, Russians came, even though today this vast chunk of land, which is called Russian Far East, it was not Russian territory formally until 1860. Then when China was suffering from the European invasions in the south, Russians took advantage of it and cut over this huge chunk of land from China. So the Russian Far East became Russian territory. Now, the Soviet Union, we have to wait another 40, 50 years. Okay? So at that time, Russians also occupied Sakhalin, but already on this area, the Hokkaido and Kuril Island and Sakhalin, and also Kamchatka, not Kamchatka, but many island chains here, there were a lot of people living. Japanese were living there, Russians were living there, fishermen, but of course, the indigenous peoples, or various kinds of indigenous peoples who are related to Eskimos and so on. Koreans from Korean Peninsula here, they started to migrate to Manchuria. Why? Because Manchuria, even though today it is a firmly Chinese territory, Manchuria was a land where Chinese could not go until around 1860s. The reason being, the Manchus who conquered China in early 17th century and created the very powerful Qing dynasty. And so Manchus were from here, this Manchuria, and they prohibited anyone, both Han Chinese and Koreans, to enter their sacred ancestral homeland. And that's why, until very late stage in 19th century, Manchuria was virtually empty. Okay? Most people who were living in Manchuria then, because Manchus migrated to China to rule China. So there were powerful military, the so-called 8th Flag Army, was staying here, training almost every day. Right? So that was the situation. But then Europeans came, and then the China could not really control its border. So they finally opened up, the Manchus finally opened up this border from China. So those Chinese from two provinces, Hebei and Shandong, swarmed into Manchuria, and also Koreans went to Manchuria. So that's how that migration happened, and later this part of Manchuria firmly became Chinese territory. Now, when Koreans were migrating to the north, this land, even though formally became Russian territory 1860, but not many Russians. So the Koreans who ended up living here, later they became Soviet Koreans or Russian Koreans. The Koreans who settled in the left side of this is a big river, the Songhua River in Chinese call, and people who settled here, they later become Chinese Koreans. Okay? So very interesting history. And so already some Koreans were here in Sakhalin by already a little bit in the 1860s, there were some Koreans there. But anyway, so that's the story. And of course, after Korea was colonized by Japan, formally from 1910, but already from very early stage of the 20th century, when Japan defeated Russia during the Russo-Japanese War, started in 1904 and ended next year, 1905. Then no country could really claim Korea except Japan. So Japan virtually colonized already Korea, early 20th century, but not from 1910, formally Korea became a part of the Japanese Empire. And then, because now Korea is a part of Japanese Empire and Japan's main islands were very much industrializing, they needed a lot of workforce. And of course, Koreans, they went to Japan as an international students, but also a lot of them as workers, because Korea was not industrial at all, but Japan was. So that's why these Koreans came there. And then from Japan, later, they heard that if you go Sakhalin or Hokkaido and Sakhalin, which was a very newly developing Japan's frontiers, the wage was higher. So some Koreans moved up and ended up living on the island of Sakhalin. After Russo-Japanese War, by the way, it was the Russians who occupied this island first, already 1854. But as I say, very few Russians were there, and the Japanese, some fishermen and some coal industry was there. So Koreans also came, and they mostly stayed in the southern part of Sakhalin, which Japanese call Karafuto. So that's the background. And Karafuto, this southern part of the island, this is a 50s parallel. So after Russo-Japanese War, Japan and Russia agreed that we will divide this island in two, and northern part belongs to Russian Empire, and southern part, Karafuto, belongs to Japanese Empire. So on this island, of course, as I said, there are already, for 1,000 years, the indigenous peoples were living there, various kind. The largest ones were Ainu. As you know, that Ainus live northern Honshu and Hokkaido and southern part of Sakhalin. And then there are some other people who are called Nipkis, or some other way, they are called Gilyaks. Anyway, so these people were living. And as I said, 1854, Russia claimed sovereignty on that island. And actually, Anton Chekhov, the famous Russian author, he was exiled on that island. So he was the first one who wrote about that island. Okay. Anyway, and 1904, as I said, the Japanese Empire took southern part of the island, and it formally became Japanese territory. Now, this Koreans now, they are different. They are Koreans, but meanwhile, as I said, Koreans who migrated to Manchuria and southern Siberia, which is called Far East, Russian Far East, they are different. They are mostly from northern part of the Korean peninsula. Meanwhile, most Koreans living here, because they went there after Japan's occupation of Korea, they are mostly from southern part of Korea. So now we have two kinds of Koreans. Koreans who originated from northern tip of the Korean peninsula, settled in this area, Russian Far East, especially around Vladivostok. Vladivostok was the center of Korean culture briefly in early 20th century. Why? So many Koreans, after Korea was occupied by Japan, exiled. And there were intellectuals, there were Korean newspaper, there was even Korean teachers college in Vladivostok. But these Koreans, unfortunately, this is Vladivostok Korean street here, the Goreyskaya Ulica in Vladivostok. It is there still today. And so if you look at Vladivostok, Vladivostok is very similar to another very interesting city across the Pacific Ocean, which is San Francisco. It's a very hilly, as you see here. Okay, so anyway, this was a Korean street. There were a lot of Koreans, as I said. And as you see here, these Korean kids attending schools and with the Orthodox priest. So these Koreans, they didn't come to Sakhalin, okay? And they were living in continent. And the people who were living in continent here, unfortunately, 1937, Stalin arrested all of them after killing a few thousand elite there, and they forced them, they took them all the way, nearly 6,000 kilometers away to Central Asia. So suddenly these Koreans living in the Russian Far East, they were forced to migrate in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And that's why today we have Koreans there. So after they were forced to migrate, as you see in elementary school, you see some Korean students together with Russians and Uzbeks and all kinds of people. Tashkent was the very multicultural and multiracial city within the Soviet Union. It used to be third largest city in entire Soviet Union. But anyway, so as you see here in the classroom, you see Russians, Uzbeks, and some Germans, Poles who were also forced migrated from European front to Central Asia. So now this is the we call them Soviet Koreans. Okay. And now let's come back to Karafuto. The Japanese call it Karafuto here on this map, and or Minami Sakhalin, the South Sakhalin. And this was one prefecture, one of the Japanese prefecture. And so this is prefectural government house in the city, which today called Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, which literally means that southern Sakhalin city in Russian. But in Japanese, they call it Toyohara, which means very fertile field, the fertile hills, because it is extremely fertile. But anyway, so Koreans were living here with the Japanese, actually under Japanese. And so, and the number, once upon a time, the number was probably around over nearly 50,000, I think. But anyway, so that's how Koreans were living there. And what did they do, the Koreans there? Japanese really revered that part of their territory because it is really untapped. It's a vast land, and there are so many good natural resources. Like Hokkaido, it's very similar to Hokkaido. The nature and the fauna and flora and so on. And this island is full of coal, good quality coal. So that's why Koreans were needed there mostly for two industries, coal mining and timber. That these two. So these are all Koreans working in coal mines. And this is coal mine here. As you see, these are all Koreans. They are newly recruited and sometime in late 1930s, and they are trained. And this is the mining town on Sakhalin. There are so many, but one of them, and even women. I can't tell if they are all Japanese or Koreans, but because they are all wearing Japanese style, the working garment, but I think mostly Koreans, and the women would select good quality coal from bad quality coal. And this is one of the timber mill on the island, and they are all Koreans. As you see, the huge amount of timber. Even Sakhalin, even Hokkaido today, Hokkaido is famous for timber production, but Sakhalin was even more because the land was pretty good. It was slightly further north of Hokkaido, so all kinds of hardwood was produced on the island. Is it battery? Okay, it works now. Okay, sure. Okay, so that's the situation. And as I said, before late 1930s, Koreans went there voluntarily because they heard the wage was higher there. And of course it was, even for Japanese. Even during Soviet Union time, if you worked there, your salary was 3 times more than the ones in Moscow. And that was quite typical throughout Soviet Union. But after 1938, now Japan already entered war with China in 1937, and a lot of Japanese men were taken to the battlefield. So in Japanese main island, there was a huge shortage of men. And these men, this void was filled by Koreans who were now forced to come and work in Japan. And that's why later, if you imagine that in Japan, less Japanese men continuously going to the war, and now Koreans were taken from southern part of the Korea. And so there was a different sex ratio between men and women in Japan. And that's why many marriages happened between Korean men and Japanese women. Okay, but that's not part of our story today. Now, the war ended in 1945. Already, as we know, August 15, the Japanese emperor declared that, emperor really did not say we lost or anything. He said, no, it's ending, okay? But formally, September the 2nd, the Japanese government representatives signed they are surrendering, okay? So formally, the Pacific War ended on the 2nd day of September. And now, as you see here, the Japanese, this is Toyohara, the Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk today, and Japanese were allowed to leave. Now, this was everywhere in Southeast Asia, which was occupied by British and Americans, and Pacific Island, the Americans, and even in Korea, Americans sent Japanese back. And Koreans in Japan were sent back to Korea. And so here, the Soviets, they are allowing the Japanese to leave. So this is a long, a large number of Japanese people. There were about 360,000 Japanese living on that island at the time when Russians came in. So they, not all, but most of them left. And then 43,000 Koreans were not allowed to leave. This was a big disaster because for Koreans, now war ended, like Japanese, they wanted to go home. But Soviets did not allow them to leave. There are some reasons why. I will go back to that. Because first of all, Koreans were formerly the citizens of the Japanese Empire until then. Okay? Japan has many colonies, but Korea and Taiwan, these two were given special kind of status. So they were considered as Japanese citizens. So, but as soon as the war ended, now the Japan, there was no government in, there was a government in Japan, but almost automatically it was considered, the Soviets considered that now these guys are not Japanese citizens and we don't have any obligation to send them back. And that's why they stayed there. But also Soviet Union doesn't have any diplomatic relations with Koreans. And in Korea, you have to wait until 1948 when this two separate government was established in South Korea as a South Korea and North Korea as a communist country. And also, more than that, Soviets, they desperately needed manpower. So many Russians were killed during the Second World War, as we know, and this vast Siberia, they need people, and of course, Sakhalin, they need people. And why should they let these Koreans go? And that's why they were captured. And Koreans had to do whatever they were doing before the war. And now, however, these Koreans are different from the other Koreans whom Stalin forced to move to Central Asia, because those Koreans were living in the Soviet Union as being educated as a Soviet citizen and so on, and they speak good Russian and their educational level is very high and they understand the communism. And there were many party members. Now, Soviet government would bring some of them to re-educate these Koreans on the island of Sakhalin. And many people remember those days with great bitterness. They are same Koreans, but they are communist. And they came and they treated the Koreans on the island of Sakhalin as Japanese minions, puppets, and so on. So a lot of that first generation, the Koreans, remember those days that it was extremely difficult and hard time. Anyway, so this is as you see here, from 1949, 1950, the class of 1949-50 at school, and these are Korean students. And of course, there's Karl Marx and Lenin and Stalin's photo. This is quite typical in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, interestingly, if you enter school and form a class at primary school, until you graduate, that members of that class doesn't change. So you know all these kids from year 1 to year 6 or 7, whatever, and then they go to junior high school, same thing. So I don't know if it is a really good idea to have that kind of system, but people, they build very strong bond among themselves. A lot of marriages also happen there as well. But anyway, so these Koreans, now after Russians came and not allowing them to leave, so they had to continue what they were doing. And you can imagine what they would feel. Suddenly, there was a language problem. Now, the Koreans were bilingual. They could speak Korean and Japanese, reading and write as well. But suddenly, now, that was all prohibited and everything is Russian. And also, they could not go home because like many migrants in those days, they went there to make some money and go home and, and then buy probably some land and have a happy life as a farmer with their family. So that was their goal. Now, this is totally devastated, and Soviet Union is not open country, especially that island. But even when I visited that island, it was closely monitored. Sakhalin and Vladivostok as a naval port of the Soviet Union, no one was actually allowed. I was one of the very few people who were allowed to visit the city. And this is a typical photo of Sakhalin Korean families. Sometime, I believe this was early 1970s. And maybe this gentleman is either their friend or the local Communist Party director or something. And this is this gentleman's 60th birthday, which is a very big day for Koreans in their life. And now severed from any communication or anything from their home, and suddenly with so exotic foreigners, the Russians, the Koreans were living together, and they were desperate. They wanted to go home, but they were not allowed. So some people bravely wrote letters. You see this letter here, it's beautifully written in Russian. So this was probably after, at least 10 years after the Soviet occupation of the southern Sakhalin, because that gave them enough time to master Russian. So now they became trilingual. Even names of people, they have 3 names: Korean name, and then the Japanese forced them to change their names. That was Japan's policy in Korea. So most Koreans in those days, they had a Japanese name. So the people whom I met in 1990, the man would introduce themselves to me in Korean name, knowing that I'm a Korean. But otherwise, they would say, my Japanese name is Tokuda, and my Russian name is Sasha or something. So very interesting. And somehow this letter reached to South Korea in early 70s. And considering that it was during a Cold War time, this is just amazing. And also, but later, when Soviet Union was reaching its end in late 1980s, the communication became much better, and some letters could reach to South Korea, or sometimes via Japan. And now this is not letter. This is 1984, November the 1st. And this man, he wrote down, before he died, he wrote down for his descendant that even though you guys never met your grandparents and your cousins and uncles in Korea, these are their names. And then he wrote his original place where he was born, in the hope that sometime in the future, his children could meet those of their relatives. Now, here and there are many cemeteries, just like anywhere, and many parts of the cemetery you see the epitaph inscripted with Korean writing, and it says, they put their original address in Korea, in South Korea, and then their name and when they were born. And here in New Zealand, this is rather rare, but the Slavic people tend to put their photos on their tombstone. So following that tradition, I think, when their mother passed away, the children made this and put her photo and written in Korean. And by late, I think by year 2008, South Korea government started to launch a new project, which was to find and record all the Koreans who passed away or killed on the island of Sakhalin. So the South Korean government officials came and they would record every tomb, and so that it's because it is a part of important history for them. And this is a letter that I received, I believe it was 1991, which reached me to Honolulu, Hawaii, in the US. Okay, this is the University of Hawaii, and you see my name here, and beautiful Russian, and it says SSSR, so USSR, and his letter begins with Korean, but mostly now it is Japanese and ending with Korean. They're amazing because they were losing Korean because they didn't use Korean for such a long time and they had to learn Russian, but their Japanese, the second language, stayed longer. And this is one of the many, they are very generous, the Koreans. When I met them first time in 1990, of course, they didn't have any idea, but this was the Soviet Union. They never saw any foreigners except a few North Koreans who came because North Korea and Russia, they are friendly countries. And when they realized me as a Korean, originally from South Korea, they would just shed tears without saying anything. And their life, through this story, you can imagine that life in countryside, the Soviet Union, was not terribly bad. Because they were working at mines and timber mills and so on in remote area, even on this island, the mines are not in the city, they're in the countryside. And their salary was higher, but there was nowhere to spend the money. You are given your salary in ruble, but in countryside, remote island, where there's no Gucci, no BMW, nothing. So without any intention, they accumulated money. Of course, this money will lose its value very quickly after the end of the Soviet Union. But material life was not terribly bad if we are talking about the basics: apartment and food, especially that island. And they asked me, so where are you staying? And I said, foreigners in those days, you could not stay anywhere. Foreigners in the Soviet Union, you must stay only one hotel, which is called in-tourist hotel. And that's horribly expensive. It's an extremely shabby hotel that you wouldn't want to spend, pay even $5 a night, but that's a US $100 every single night. And so Koreans there, they know that, and they said, don't worry, come, I have 2 apartments empty. So they put me to one of their apartments. And this apartment in communist system was given by the coal mine company as a kind of welfare system. However, they didn't live there. They lived in old houses built by Japanese before the war. Because for them, they say it is more convenient for us, but also there is a land. So they could cultivate vegetables and flowers. The flowers they sell at the market, and that's how I met them. When I went to the city, first place I went was a market, and there I saw Koreans. I also met one Japanese as well, who didn't leave because her husband was Korean, and somehow she stayed. So you see that a lot of vodkas, great amount of food, all kinds, Russian and Korean, all the mixture. And that's what I'm the only one who is not. Actually, yeah, this is Japan. She's a Japanese from Asahi Shimbun. We were there almost at the same time, but we studied together at the University of Hawaii, and it was not planned, but we were there. So we were both invited to a party. Now, as I said, their biggest goal was to return home. And there was some Koreans, actually about 400 Koreans, could return to Japan when Japanese were allowed to return. And that's why, because their wives were Japanese. I already mentioned to you, because of the huge sex ratio differences between Japanese men and women throughout Japan, including Sakhalin, because of the war. So a lot of Korean men married Japanese women. So when Japanese were returned second time by the Soviet Union, their husband, Korean husband, were allowed to live together. And these Koreans who came to Japan and then later to South Korea, they started this activism, telling the world that there are people who are captured and we should rescue them. So that started in 1972, South Korean broadcasting system, which is the biggest, the government-owned, sponsored Korean radio and TV station. They started to send out programs at night so that people in Sakhalin, after finishing their work, they could listen. And this was, this immediately created the ocean of tears. Suddenly, now they can hear Korean. And in this program, a lot of families were looking for, I heard my so-and-so, from my grandfather who passed away, that one of my cousins went to that island and we are looking for them. And also people on Sakhalin, they also did. So eventually, but still they could not come back. But eventually, late 1980s and early 1990s, Japan and South Korean government, they agreed to help them to come back to Korea. So that's how eventually they could come. So this is early 1990s, that they are all second generation and they are holding something from their parents. Okay, so this is the letter or photo of father, and this is in Sakhalin, and this typical the room decoration during the Soviet time. He has his wife's photo who passed away many years ago, and this is very new. Later, when these Sakhalin Koreans were allowed to travel to South Korea, actually, of course, you can see there's a lot of, not very much, but there were some interracial marriages, and the daughter had some inherent the sickness, and the South Korean doctors help the family. When these people first came to South Korea, the first thing they would do is to open a funeral, which of their parents or someone who passed away, which they could not attend because they were on Sakhalin. So that's what they do. And this South Korean government established this nursing home kinds of a huge facility. And so they are taken care by the care workers. And I will finish my talk here, but as I said, these Koreans, not Sakhalin Koreans, who went to Central Asia, now you can imagine that their culture, they have gone through many different cultures. First, the Japanese culture during the colonial period, but then Central Asia and also Russian. So their food reflects that. So this is a typical dinner table, and you don't see chopstick, so only spoon and fork, and with Russian style soup and the Central Asian salad and so on. And this is a Sakhalin food, by the way, and featured with seaweed. Russians didn't know about seaweed. When Russians migrated from European part to Russian Far East, when they confronted ethnic Koreans there, these two ethnic groups, very quickly they exchanged the food culture. For Russians, that part is the seaweed. I mean, here in New Zealand, we don't eat that much seaweed, but Koreans and Japanese, their seaweed consumption is the highest in the world. So quickly, this kind of Korean food, the seaweed turned into salad. Now you can buy it anywhere in Russia and Ukraine or Belarus at supermarket. And this is a Marskaya kapusta. What does it mean? The Russians, not knowing the seaweed, they called it marine cabbage. Isn't it a great name? Okay? And also, this is also the kapusta kimchi. Okay, so interesting that they even make kimchi with this, but also real kimchi as well. So these are, you can find, when I was living in Ukraine briefly, didn't have any problem in getting buying kimchi because on every supermarket they sell it. Okay? So this shows some cultural legacies that Koreans left in the Soviet Union and on the island of Sakhalin. So I will finish my talk with this, and if you have any question, then I will be very happy to engage in conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. You can imagine how heartrending it would be to have your family separated like that. And I think we can think of many circumstances around the world where that's happened, unfortunately. But yeah, the merging of the food, the fusion food, if you like, fascinates me. You know, we've got experience here with fusion foods as well, but that fusion between Russian and Korean and perhaps a bit of Chinese and Japanese in there as well, it fascinates me. I'd like to know what it tastes like. But has anyone got any questions, please, for Dr. Song?
Yes, please. Yeah. Liam. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation on such an interesting piece of history. I just wondered when finally the breakup of the Soviet Union happened and the Sakhalin Koreans were then free to move back to South Korea. Did the majority of the Korean population leave Sakhalin, or did some stay behind?
Very good question. This the South Korean government allowed only the first generation Koreans who were born before August 1945. And they will be given automatic South Korean residency and even citizenship. But so that means their descendant, the second generation, third generation, fourth generation young people today, they are not given the freedom to come and leave. However, because their parents are there, so they can travel. That's not a problem. However, in early stage in 1990s, a lot of young people also came together with their parents, and they tried to test it if they could live in South Korea. However, these are two vast different societies. South Korea being capitalistic and industrialized and small and packed society, while Sakhalin, you develop different kinds of hobbies and entertainment, and you can go hunting, bear hunting even, and salmons every early summer. I was invited to catch salmons. The salmons are enormous amount of salmon. You cannot wade a small stream because of the salmon, right? But anyway, so young people, they saw more opportunity in the newly opened Russia rather than in South Korea. So those people do not come, but others, they join their parents.
During the Second World War, I gather Japan and Soviet Union were technically neutral or not at war, and the 50th parallel remained. Soviets are north and Japanese south. Yeah, and I understand that beside coal and timber, as you say, I didn't know, there was a lot of oil found. Oil wells.
Yes, that's all in, yeah.
On the north and south of Sakhalin?
Mm-hmm. No, it's mostly in the north, far north. There's a city called Oha, and that's the big oil field and gas.
In the USSR part,
yes.
section.
Well, that was developed after the war.
Oh yeah, developed after the war. Oh yes. I knew a lady, I met a lady, a Russian lady who lived in Sakhalin in the maybe in the 60s, maybe 70s, and her parents worked in Sakhalin for American oil companies like Esso and that, and they were obviously had rights to oil, and so that was an industry. I'm not sure where she lived, whether it was the north or south, but after the fall of Japan in September 1945, did the Soviets occupy the whole of Sakhalin, or they took it over? Did they, or was Japan still owning up to the 50th parallel
after the Pacific War?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So is that
who owned south of Sakhalin after 1945?
The Soviet started to attack the Japanese troops on the southern part of the island already in very early, I believe it was late August, because Soviets were there on the northern part of the island. So they very quickly violating that neutrality treaty. They came down and attacked. There was a huge battles here and there on the island. Japanese didn't surrender when they were attacked. And so there was a big fight between the Japanese troops and Soviet troops.
So who owns the South Sakhalin now?
Oh, that's Russia. That's the Soviet Union. Yeah. That gentleman behind. Oh,
Jenny says, thank you from Wellington. She's looking forward to visiting Korea soon. And Brent wants to know where he could experience this fusion food in Auckland.
Yes, well, I can make, but actually we have, I don't know how many, we have at least several Soviet Koreans who migrated here from Moscow, but also from Kazakhstan. I met them, and they know how to prepare. This is very simple. This is just salad. But there are many different kinds of fusion food, which I personally very much love. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering what got you interested in studying these Koreans who got in this predicament?
Wow. Okay. Oh, that's a very fundamental question. Well, Yeah, it takes me, that's why I'm particularly happy today, because I forgot about this part of my experience for already more than 3 decades. And I came today to talk about my personal experience on the island. It reminded me, those days when I was a young postgraduate student in America, with the generous U.S. federal government support, because I was extremely lucky getting this huge scholarship. And that scholarship included, very unusual scholarship, included that I could do something I really wanted in terms of travel or experience. And some of my colleagues, they wanted to live in the center of New York City and so on, because we were living in Honolulu. But I volunteered to travel the Soviet Union for 1 year because I was interested in Korean diaspora community. And that's why I went first time, University of Hawaii, and the Far Eastern State University had some relationship. And so we were the first bunch of students from America who were allowed to stay in Vladivostok. Vladivostok was close to the city because with neighbor facilities for foreigners, but we were unusually accepted. But now that goes back to history. When Russian Revolution happened, a lot of wealthy Russians, they escaped the country from Vladivostok, and the first port they stayed was Honolulu before they further go to San Francisco. So in Honolulu, they have some the Russian legacies and so on. But anyway, to your question, I was interested in the ethnic Koreans living in the Soviet Union, and that's why I decided to visit. But it ended up taking me almost everywhere in the Soviet Union because Koreans were scattered. And that's because of the Soviet system, again, that after you graduate school, government can send you anywhere. So the Koreans were almost everywhere. And that's why food like kimchi spread quickly throughout the entire Soviet Union. Thank you.
Thank you. Natalia is commenting that there was a wave of recent immigration of young male Koreans from Sakhalin to South Korea to avoid conscription to the army due to the Russian-Ukraine war.
Oh, yeah, actually, in the last 2 years, especially last year, about few hundred, I heard almost 700 Koreans came from Ukraine from Ukraine, because there are Koreans. I mean, Koreans, even though these forced migrants who were taken to Central Asia, they were mostly in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, but they didn't have any freedom to move because they were labeled as enemy nations. And that was how the Stalin punished people. So they could not move. But after Stalin's death in 1953, by 1960s, they were given more freedom. So quickly, they sent their children to schools in Moscow and Leningrad and all over Soviet Union. And by the time when they graduate, now government will send them here and there. So Koreans were widely spread out. So that's how this. But then southern Russia and Ukraine, because of the fertility, the land is very fertile, especially in Ukraine, the so-called black earth soil. It is very fertile. So many of these Koreans were farmers, and they were doing something amazing, that industrial level farming. Even though that was privated during socialist time, but many Koreans earned money through that kind of activities. And that's why there are still many Koreans living in Ukraine and southern Russia along the Black Sea coast. And now many of them, they came to South Korea in the last last 2 years.
further questions? Just reiterating for those online and also in the audience, in about 3 weeks' time, this will be on our YouTube channel. I know lots of you like to re-listen, re-watch again after you've been. It's, you know, quite often a lot to take in during one sitting. So go to our YouTube channel in about 3 weeks' time, or do it now and subscribe to our channel, and then you'll be notified when it goes live online. Any other questions?
I'm going to ask a question. Dr. Song, this might be out of your experience, but I wonder, do you think that because of the Russia-Ukraine war, that the opening between Sakhalin Koreans and South Korea, do you think that that openness is at risk of change because of that conflict?
Well, I mean, the Ukraine is almost the western end, southwestern end of the Russia, and Sakhalin is a far eastern end. So I don't think people very much would feel the impact of the war on the island of Sakhalin, because that was true even during the Soviet time, that this island, the life was just going on by themselves. Of course, they were ruled by the center, but the lifestyle, everything, I don't think there's a huge impact on these particular Koreans living on Sakhalin because of this Ukrainian war. But I think just like that, the person who raised the question of young Koreans escaping from the military service, I'm sure that there are many who would try to escape.
About the third slide, there was a tourism photo in the top right-hand corner.
Yes, I remember. Yeah.
Was that promoting some sort of tourism?
Yes, that's from, this is Karafuto. So please go travel to Karafuto. This was an advertisement in Japan and Tokyo and Osaka and big cities and Kobe. And this cruise boat would take tourists to Karafuto, Sakhalin.
In Japan or Sakhalin?
Karafuto is Japanese name for Sakhalin.
Yeah.
Oh. Oh, which one? Okay, sure. Which one are you talking about? The letters of people?
Yeah, I believe that is the slide. The archival source was the question.
Yeah, these are the personal letters. This is an envelope and the address, who is sending to whom. So this is just the letter address, and the content. I don't have any content from this letter, but this is an envelope, very old envelope. I believe this was sometime in 1970s. Yeah, sent to South Korea.
And who collected the letters?
Oh, this was families have in South Korea and in Sakhalin, and South Korean newspaper, the companies, they went and they took photos. The Korean government has done a lot of work on these people, and they took many digital images from their old letters and books and so on.
It's fascinating, especially the one where basically genealogical information is given on the on the page. Yeah, that's really special. Help to connect back to the homeland, as it were. So yeah, that means something to us family historians, I guess, especially. So yeah, we've got not any other questions coming through. We've got lots of thanks online for the interesting presentation. And Brent's been posting a lot of links about what you've been talking about in the chat for people to go and have a look at. So thank you so much for your talk today. It's been really good to have you in here to tell us a bit more about this. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of our
Well,
library.
thank you for
you.
listening. Thank you very much. Thank you.